discussion around getting better as an employee and improving. We usually divide this up a couple ways. HR is usually in charge of architecting this process. That is ensuring that it's done in a fair way, reasonably up to speed. Make sure managers have everything they need to manage their employees. Employees know what to expect, stuff like that. But usually it's the managers are the ones who actually give the ratings. If I'm in HR for a group of accountants and I have 300 accountants that I support, I'm probably not going to evaluate their performance because I'm not an accountant. Probably their manager, their lead accountant, would be the one who would have the subject matter expertise to rate their performance. So not usually done by HR, but designed, architected, and executed through HR. Who conducts them in addition to managers? Kind of everybody can. It really depends on how much money and how much time you're willing to put in the process to make sure it's good. There's a thing called a 360-degree feedback. You can get that. It's kind of all around. So I'll just take my job as a faculty. I have a department chair who evaluates me. I have co-workers, I have peers who will sit in on my classes or evaluate my research, and I have students who evaluate me through the student evaluation of instruction. So in each way, it's not perfect, right? I don't have taxpayers come in and evaluate my performance, even though they're the ones paying for it. But the idea here is the more people you can get to assess, assuming you believe in the validity of the assessment, then the more accurate the picture of the performance might be. The other thing that this helps, having a multi-source appraisal, is if I have a really bad relationship with my manager, but I'm actually a pretty darn good employee, my manager won't be the only one having voice in that discussion. So it is harder, it's more complex to normalize the data. Good HR person can set this up. There's all kinds of third-party providers that set this up. Would we do this all the time? Probably not. It's expensive and time consuming. Would we do it on some key roles or maybe senior leadership roles? Yeah, we probably would. We probably should in terms of validity. So let's get into a few methods. What are the tools that people use to do this? A very popular one is called the graphic rating scale. So basically I rate someone high, low. There are some drawbacks to it. If you rated me, for instance, you said, Avey as a professor, boy, he's really good at making copies, but he's not very good at talking to students. Well, that means I did good on one, bad on the other. We left out the idea that the second one is probably much more important than the first one. So it doesn't allow us always to kind of rate what's the most important, but usually the idea is to let us get the breadth of the job, everything involved. Here's an example in terms of kind of an overall outstanding. They're very successful, top 10%, unsatisfactory. I don't know if this person's going to be here. Maybe they should let go, and everything in between. You can go based on expectations if you want. That's popular, exceeds, below expectations. The challenge with that, as we know, is that expectations vary within and between people. So if you have 3 managers in a room that just evaluated their team, that's 3 different sets of expectations. You have to somehow normalize that data when you end up coming together. Probably the most valid approach with a graphic rating scale would be what's called behaviorally anchored rating scales, or BARS, another one of the HR acronyms. The purpose of BARS is to create the anchors, but not set on expectations, to be set on actual behaviors. So here's an example in terms of customer service. Outstanding service exceeds expectations. Outstanding service, in this case, is use positive phrases to explain a product. So the more that you can tie them to behaviors, it's a lot of work. I get it. When I have this conversation during consulting, you can see just the overwhelmed look on managers and HR people like, she's going to take forever. Yes, it does take a long time. And if there isn't massive shift in the nature of the work, if you do it once right the first time, it should be a sustainable benefit to the organization. Ranking's fine. You get a 1 through N. I have 6 people on my team. I just rank them the best through the worst, 1 through 6. One of the challenges with that, of course, is that you can't get degrees of separation. So on my team, I might have 6 people. I might have 2 people who could run it by themselves. Like, they're incredible. They pull up everybody else. They're the mistake eraser. I mean, they're just incredible. And the bottom 4 are kind of subpar. Well, it looks like number 3 is just a little bit less optimal than number 2 if I do a ranking, but in real life, there's a massive gap right there. So ranking works fine. Better not to do it mechanically to crank out like a salary increase because it won't recognize those the variance in performance. Force distribution is another one that works. You can say, some people are going to be high, some people are going to be low, and on average, people are average. I should say, remember that the rest of your life. It's kind of one of my lines I throw out in class a lot. On average, people are average. Nobody thinks they're average, but on average, people are average. So this would be on a scale of 1 to 5. Most people get a 3. There's a handful of 4s, handful of 2s. There's a couple 5s and a couple 1s. This works. But what if you have overall a really low performing team, a bunch of boneheads, and you have to go sit down with a half of that team and say they were above average. When in your head you're like, yeah, you're above average on the team, but our team stinks. Or reverse that. What if you have a team with just stellar all-stars, lots of years of experience, great track record of results? You have to sit down with half of that team and tell them they're below average. So it can create some social, some relationship problems between the manager and the people who are being rated. Force distribution is, again, it works if you're talking about a big enough sample size. If you're talking about, your whole company, 200 people, yes, on average, people are average. But you as a manager may have a specific team that doesn't necessarily fit the force distribution model. Looks something like this, then you can see it. On average, people meet expectations. But again, the forcing is kind of fitting a square peg into a round hole. Sometimes it doesn't fit. If the sample size is big enough, usually it will. There's another one called the narrative method. I recommend this as a supplementary method, not as a primary method. It is useful. And you hear stuff, if you're a manager, you've heard stuff like you have to document this, right? Document what happened because we're going to give them a raise. Document what happened because we're going to fire them. Some of that's driven back to if I was to take that mindset and apply it completely to the performance evaluation process, you'd have what's called the narrative method. And this is the joke is a manager walking around with a black book, and every time you do something, opens it up and kind of writes it down. This can be abused really easily. A lot of training is required for managers on how to do this. They sit down once a year with the employee. They look at the record at the annual evaluation and they walk through it. Well, negative is stronger than positive, right? And so most things that you do well don't stand out unless they're really extremely well. And most things that you do poorly do stand out more because they're deviant from the norm. And so you have a manager who sits down with an employee and they have a list of, these are the 30 dumb things you've done over the last year. You have an employee go, what about the 3,000 good things I did? Like, do you have any of those by chance? So it can create some problems. If you are, like, if I have a manager call says, I have to fire this person, it's performance related, we suspect there's going to be a lawsuit, an appeal, something, a grievance, I'll go, okay, stick with the narrative method for a while because that's really your ammunition. The narrative method will provide you with the justification you need to take action if you need to take action. So it's nice to supplement with this. Very few places do this exclusively. I'm told that in school districts, this is still how it's done, meaning like a high school teacher, you have a principal that comes in and writes a page, 2 pages kind of evaluation. Last I heard, Boeing Employees Credit Union was doing this, but outside of that, it's a good supplementary method. Think of it like you have a toolbox as a manager, right? This is one of the tools in your kit. It doesn't apply to every particular situation. Yeah, an essay. Last one is more of a principle. It's kind of a method, but it's also more of a principle, and that is, it's called management by objectives. So here's the idea. Let's say, like I don't want a tool. I don't want a force distribution. I don't want a ranking. I want to make it simpler where it's fair to my employees and I can assess their performance. So MBO, management by objectives, is where you sit down with someone once a year, once every 3 months, every 6 months, whatever it is. But usually it's annually, and you say, these are your objectives for the year. This is what I would like the business is asking you to deliver, in a sense, for your salary here, for your spot here. And the employee comes back and says, I can do more. Well, okay, we figure it out. The employee comes back and says, those are unfair expectations. I can't do that. And so there's some negotiation, but you lay out the objectives. These are these 5 statements, and then you define, here's what success looks like, and here's what failure looks like for these 5 things that we said were your job for the next year. From there forward, management of that person's performance looks like meeting with them, pulling out that piece of paper and go, let's go through the 5. Like, how are we doing? We agreed 8 weeks ago, 8 months ago, this is what constitutes good performance on your job. Like, how you doing? How can I support you? What do you need? Is there anything blocking you from being able to be successful as we together defined it? MBO is kind of based on this precedent of it's a book, Seven Habits of Highly Effective People. I might have mentioned it before. Dumb book, don't read it. But the second, let me just comment on that. When I rip on books, whenever a book comes out and says, now these are the 6 things to be a great leader, or the 3 I's of leadership, I'm like, oh my gosh, it's horrible. It totally disregards context. Every area, every culture, right? Organizational culture is unique. So apologize for my bad attitude. But it's based on this idea of number 2 from this book, begin with the end in mind. And that is, let's all agree right now where we're going. It's almost like organizational strategy or mission. Let's agree where we're going. If we can agree where we're going, then we can begin to draft up some objectives and some tactics to help us get there. But let's start with that. Let's define the future. So we're sitting here, you and I, in this one-on-one performance evaluation conversation, and we say, okay, in 1 year from right now, what do we want to look back and go, this is what we did, this is how we did it, and this is how it was a win for the business and for the person doing it. So that's it. Begin with the end in mind. That kind of informs the process of MBO. Again, I said this at the beginning, I'll say it again. There is no single method. If a manager says, this is how we used to do performance in my company, let's do it here, that's where you want to go. Time out, wait a second. Does it fit with the culture? Does it fit with the job? If you evaluate a NASA engineer, it's different than if you evaluate someone who's bucking bales of hay than it is someone who's fill in the blank, making French fries. So you got to figure out what fits, what kind of performance is even measurable. If they're quantitative basis for performance, there's a firm that I have a lot of respect for. It's called Lamb Weston. They're out in Quincy. And a lot of their leaders are judged on kind of a dashboard of quantitative output. So there's no question, if you're a manager, leader, shift supervisor, there's no question of, did I do a good job today? Like the numbers are right there in front of your face, and you can modify your behavior according to that feedback. Some jobs don't have that, right? So like, I'll state mine, like as a professor, like you try hard, you do your best, you do what you think works, and you find out in 5 years when someone calls you and says, hey, I'm the youngest HR manager of this X company, and I've been doing what you said, and you're like, oh man, maybe I did something right. So some jobs give you quick feedback, and some jobs aren't really designed for it. So you got to pick the one that fits for that job. There are, of course, problems in the interview. I already mentioned that the biggest thing is probably the person's relationship with their manager. So I live in Ellensburg, Washington, small town, Eastern Washington kid. I can drive a tractor and drive a quad and plow snow, and I like to be out in the mountains. Well, if my manager is from Rwanda and is an 85-year-old Rwandan woman who grew up in the Bronx, okay, we don't have a lot in common on paper in terms of demographics. So we're both going to have to work really hard to have like a trusting, optimal social exchange. So that's going to affect how she is going to evaluate my performance. So that's kind of the constant that's out there. What is the relationship like? Some other potential challenges are varying standards. The same manager has different standards for different people. Oh, that's Joanne. Well, she just went through a tough divorce, and so we're going to go a little bit easy on her in terms of performance evaluation. Then there's error in the process. The process isn't trusted, isn't valid, or vice versa. We're going to be a little bit more difficult on her, because she's been here 10 years in the same job, and we expect more of her. So varying standards between managers is usually where this is the worst. Manager evaluates performance. They go to sit with the senior manager just to cross-check it. Senior manager says, no, I don't like those people, or I don't like how you evaluated them. Recency and primacy effects. If they did one thing that stood out, also called halo effect, something about this person I really like, or one project they did. Another recency kind of effect is called Horns effect. Well, they did great all year, but 2 weeks ago they bombed on a project, so I'm going to hurt them now. So trying to take into account the whole time period. I see a thing called central tendency or leniency bias a lot. I don't see strictness bias a whole lot. So let's talk about this, because I want to extract our minds for a minute from an HR person architecting a process to a manager and an employee who maybe have known each other for years. There's a friendship, there's a professional relationship there, and the manager is going to give that person feedback, and it can't not affect their relationship. So I have a boss right now. I really like my friend. All my bosses right now are great, but if one of them has to sit down with me and say, James, like you suck at your job. Here's why, and here's the behaviors. And let's say they do it well. That's gonna put a wedge in our relationship. And so one of the things with us as HR professionals, we got to bear in mind, this is not just a process that we put together, we ship out, and we say go, and best of luck, let the chips fall where they may. This is where if managers rate somebody low, it's going to be harder for the manager to manage that person for the next year because the person's probably hurt and probably doesn't trust the manager, or at least trust them less. So we have to keep that in mind of the process. They're human beings, ego, psychology, esteem, stuff like that on the table. With these biases, central tendency is basically, if I'm scale of 1 to 5, I'm going to put everybody around a 3, maybe 1, 4, and 1, 2, but keep everybody in the middle. Why would I do that? Because I don't have to defend my decisions. I don't have to explain to everybody why you didn't get higher, because almost everybody was a 3. Leniency bias is on a scale of 1 to 5. I put everybody 4 and 5. I put everybody high because, gosh, I just love everybody. Most of the time, not all the time, but most of the time, that's a manager who is trying to avoid conflict, trying to be maybe professionally savvy, but trying to avoid conflict and hurt feelings and work for themselves. I have rarely seen strictness bias. I've seen it a couple times. It's engineer I used to work with by the name of JT. He did this once, and he came back with his evaluation on a scale of 1 to 10, and everybody was like a 1, 2, and a 3. And of course, everybody else has leniency bias, so their engineers are 8, 9, 10. And he comes in and he says, I think I did this process wrong. It was pretty funny. But strictness bias is where nobody's good enough. It's the angry dad. Nobody's good enough here. Halo and Horns, I mentioned that. The classic, of course, is, are they like me? And if someone is like me, well, they're probably good. Why? Because I have a thing called self-esteem, and I try to engage in my life in such a way to uphold that, because it hurts if I don't. So if you're like me, you're probably good. If you're not like me, you're probably bad. Very base level, archaic thinking leads to all types of bias and problems, and affects pretty much everyone. So different raters, as a manager, let me back up. As an HR person, we're aware of these and we train people in them. And you can't, you're not going to go up to somebody and say, oh, well, this is your bias. I mean, maybe it's obvious, but probably not. But you're going to say, as a manager trying to do their job right, let's keep these things in mind, right? What we're going here for is accuracy, not a manager's preference. We're going for accuracy. What is the most valid assessment of your employee's performance? As an agent of the business, that is our job as a manager, to advance the interests of the business, which may be, I don't like this person on my team, they're a jerk, I can't stand working with them, but they're really good at their job. Then their performance evaluation needs to reflect that accordingly. When you do the interviews, a few hints you can look at here. One of the biggest ones that I typically see is a manager. An employee wants to know, are they getting a raise? I get that. That's fair. A manager comes in, wants to get the meeting over with because it's kind of uncomfortable, and so they come in and they say, here are the good things, here are the bad things, have a nice day, without establishing some kind of a dialogue, like beginning the conversation with, let's talk about the year. Like what did you love? What did you hate? What was a win? What was a loss? And kind of creating a dialogue, so there's what you might call active listening. So somebody you have voice in somebody's life. So when you say, hey, you did good, they get that and they keep going. When they say, hey, let's work on this, they get that and aren't just instantly defensive. So few hints. Bottom line, this is one of the more complex but absolutely bread and butter when it comes to HR processes, is evaluating someone's performance. We use it to not only strengthen them as employees, but of course for some of our administrative and business level decisions we need to make about their career and their job. So that's it for Chapter 10.